Привіт! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Моє ім'я Наталка Гуменюк, і тут зі мною
Ангеліна Корякіна. І ми говоримо про чергового гостя Наталки. Це французький політолог, антрополог, сходознавець, філософ, напевно, так, Олів'є Руа, чиї думки і чий фокус академічний змістився за останні роки, в тому числі й через те, що зараз відбувається з Америкою. Наталко, розкажи, будь ласка, про що саме ви говорили з Олів'є Руа і чому саме про це?
Ми говорили про його останню книжку «Криза культури», яка, чесно кажучи, мене дуже зачепила. Я додам, що я знала насамперед Олів'є Руа як такого дослідника арабського світу. Він дуже багато, скажімо так, дає якихось формулювань, влучних речам. Скажімо, я там слідкувала за його роботами, коли він говорив не про ісламський фундаменталізм, радикалізм, а, наприклад, про радикалізацію ісламу. Це інше поняття, знаєш, воно все перевертає, тому що говорить, от, наприклад, 70-ті роки радикалізм був лівим, зараз радикалізм є ісламським, потім радикалізм буде іншим. Тобто, що це питання не питому релігії, а питання радикалізму, яке обирає ту течію, яка підходить. Ця книжка «Криза культури», яку я прочитала і там, здається, підкреслила кожне там третє слово, вона мене дуже вразила, тому що це така дуже вдумлива критика і обговорення того дискурсу культурного, політичної ідентичності, який зараз ми намагаємося описати. Тобто, це з одного боку, це те, з чим бореться Маск, з іншого боку, це те, що ми маємо захищати, але він, власне, говорить, я не хочу давай використаємо термін «woke», це негативний зараз термін, який набув негативної конотації, який означає перевищену увагу і перевищену чутливість до питань гендерної рівності, расової рівності, толерантності, так. Але з іншого боку, ми знаємо, що в Сполучених Штатах можна назвати вовкізмом все, що тобі не подобається, якщо ти зараз є прихильником адміністрації Трампа. Але з іншого боку, книжка його написана раніше, і вона, власне, говорить, де якісь межі, де ми не розуміємо, чому це все викликає кризу, чому це викликає такі дебати. І з іншого боку, він є величезним критиком лібертаріанської культури і неолібералізму, який, власне, говорить про те, що те, чого хотіла добитися Маргарет Тетчер, сталося, коли вона казала, не існує суспільства, існує тільки окремо чоловік, окремо жінка, окремо родина і ринок, а суспільства немає. І він, власне, говорить, що ми культурно таки живемо в світі, де суспільства в багатьох країнах немає. І ось цей індивідуалізм, з одного боку, поставив людей в неможливість захищатися. Тобто зараз ми з ним говорили про те, що чому так легко деконструювати багато речей в Сполучених Штатах, так, якщо ми говоримо про толерантність, програми з інклюзивності, тому що частина з них були символічними. Вони не змінили суті, але змінили дискурс. І оця його книга «Криза культури» говорить про те, як віртуальний світ відірвав людей від соціального, як в цьому віртуальному світі дуже складно робити реальні дії і захищати реальні права. Коли я чула його розмову з Іваном Крастєвим на гуманітарному Віденському фестивалі, тоді була інша ситуація, це було ще до виборів у Сполучених Штатах. Він, наприклад, говорив про те, як студентські протести в Сполучених Штатах, які на підтримку Гази, були недостатньо дієвими саме через те, що студенти обмежувалися символічними діями, своїми плакатами, і вони, скажімо, не виходили за межі студмістечка, так? Тому що вони окуповували якусь площу і фактично були таким, те, що ми називаємо там міжсобойчиком, між ними і керівництвом університету. Тоді як він, як людина, яка там провела час зі зброєю в 60-х роках на вулицях Парижа, на барикадах, говорив про те, що можна ж щось робити, їхати, збирати, не завжди протестувати символічно. Але за цей час змінилася, скажімо, кон'юнктура, і тому мені було з одного боку цікаво і підняти його основні думки, які він чітко сформулював, а по-друге, подивитися, як він тепер дивиться в умовах цієї деконструкції на те, що відбувається в Сполучених Штатах, і загалом, як суспільству повертатися до реальності. Бо він використовує ще чималу кількість складних термінів. Я не є філософом, і мені трошки складно ними оперувати, знаєш, але він постійно вводить якісь дуже цікаві терміни, наприклад, дереалізація, коли щось було реальним і перестало бути реальним, і стало символічним. І, зокрема, який мій теж цікавий ключ в цій розмові, коли він описував в цій книжці речі, які говорять про те, чому так важливо повертатися до реальності, я для себе збагнула, що війна нас змусила повернутися до реальності.
Ми просто перебуваємо в радикальній реальності весь час.
Так, і саме ця радикальна реальність для нас стала порятунком в чомусь для відновлення соціальних зв'язків, для розуміння там солідарності, інших речей. Тобто я там, це скажу, таке заземлення відбулося, і тому я його запитувала як читачка його книжки, коли він не мав на увазі війну проти України, але я бачила, але наводив якісь відповіді того, як суспільство має повернутися до взаємодії. Ну і, власне, я йому повертала ці думки, які ми і обговорювали.
Цікаво, звісно, чи це з філософської точки зору означає, що західний світ, який переживає саме цю кризу, рухається до якогось моменту, який поверне його в реальність. Ну, тобто, я не знаю, чи він так думає, чи це не є якимось страшним прогнозом, але щось таке в якійсь формі має відбутися, я так розумію.
Власне, так, і він не те, що закликає до цього, але пояснює, що особливо велика кількість критики, я не можу сказати, що він критикував. Я, як завжди, питаю про якісь відповіді, навіть на соціальних мережах віртуального світу, так, і всі ці питання, які критики лівого руху ставлять, я йому ставила, не будучи таким критиком, типу, так що, а ми ж профспілки не повернемося? Скажімо, він там говорив про уберизацію економіки, коли от є окремі індивіди, це ж не профспілка таксистів, і відбулося це у всіх сферах фактично, так? Коли він говорить, розумієте, економіка, вона стала фінансами. Фінанси – це щось неосяжне, це якісь банківські оборудки, якісь дії, фондовий ринок, ми його не можемо осягнути, все стало ось таким ось віртуальним, але я, власне, запитувала, а що далі? А який варіант? Та, власне, наша і розмова про те, як до цього повертатися. Так, вона саме про це. Я ще одну річ хочу додати. Насправді, ми не так багато встигли поговорити про ключову думку книжки його. Коли він говорить про кризу культури, він не говорить про кризу західної культури чи про кризу будь-якої. Він говорить, що криза є у всіх культур, але ми в сучасному світі замінили культуру нормами і кодами. Фактично він говорить про таку кодифікацію в глобальному світі, алгоритмізацію культури. Мається на увазі, що ми дійшли до якоїсь спрощеної культури. Коли люди погоджуються на те, що не є щось таке, що ти не можеш зрозуміти, ти маєш знати контекст, тут може бути тут так, а тут може бути так. Ми намагаємося зараз в сучасному світі в інтернеті унормувати культуру. Тобто створити норми, які, і це, може створювати ті питання, які виникають до руху МІТУ. Да? Коли в тебе є дуже чітке виписане правило, скажімо, алгоритм на все, і коли тобі не треба зустрічатися, говорити, а ти хочеш все запихнути в коди, і він, власне, говорить, що ми живемо в світі, в якому відбувається кодифікація.
Кодифікація не в сенсі, кодифікація в програмному сенсі, да?
Да, кодифікація в програмному сенсі, і тому дуже легко там щось критикувати з одного боку, і дуже складно ухвалювати рішення, коли замість того, щоб зрозуміти, що культура складна, і що вона дуже часто неоднозначна, і є нюанси, і в цьому весь сенс. Інколи мати контекст, інколи щось розуміти, не описуючи це словами, інтернет і глобальний світ змушує нас прийняти норми поведінки. Що йдеться зараз не про культуру, там якусь там ідентичність чи якусь культуру. От треба поставити алгоритм на кожну річ,
описати кодом, і тоді все буде окей.
Да, і тоді ти розумієш, кого кенселити, кого не кенселити. От все має бути аж ось настільки уніфіковано, і він, власне, описує цю ситуацію як доволі складну і яка є для нас викликом, щоб ми зберігали свою культуру, а не просто погодилися на світ без культури, де норми поведінки просто заміняють оцю високу культуру, якесь складніше, глибше розуміння світу.
Боже, як цікаво. Складно і цікаво, але з іншого боку, це ще про питання справедливості, про розуміння справедливості.
Власне, чого він там критикує неолібералізм? В тому, що він зацікавлений, що замість того, щоб мати соціальні інститути, де ти збираєшся, обговорюєш, вирішуєш, куди легше створити коди, норми, і які кожен індивід або виконує, або не виконує. Да? Тобто немає суспільного і соціального.
Ти аутсорсиш все, що прийнято взагалі ухвалювати в ході дискусії складної якоїсь, все, що можуть робити тільки живі люди, власне.
Да, тому наша розмова, вона така про живих людей, але в ній багато Сполучених Штатів, Дональда Трампа, Ілона Маска, війни проти України, звісно, війни як такої і суспільства, яке живе в умовах війни.
Супер, ну що ж, слухаємо цю розмову Наталки з французьким філософом, антропологом, політологом Олів'є Роа.
І я нагадаю, що відтепер ми просимо вашої підтримки, якщо ви хочете далі слухати наш подкаст, а ми хочемо його робити. В нас немає якогось окремого специфічного фінансування для нашої чудової команди, яка допомагає робити його можливим, тому ви можете в коментарях до платформ, також на сайті лабораторії, дізнатися реквізити, і як підтримуєте, ми за все будемо вдячні. Тому просимо підтримати і надсилати ваші донати для нашого подкасту.
Я би хотіла подякувати всім, хто кожного разу каже нам і особисто, і в коментарях: класний подкаст, робіть ще, нам дуже цікаво. Це момент, коли я хочу вас попросити підкріпити це своє прохання невеличкою підтримкою, такою, яка є для вас прийнятною, враховуючи, скільки ми всі зараз ініціатив, зрозуміло яких, в першу чергу на підтримку наших Збройних сил виділяємо. Але це дійсно робота не лише наша з Наталкою, а і робота нашої невеличкої, але дуже крутої команди, нашої редакторки Іри, нашої звукорежисерки Люби. Ви можете знайти реквізити лабораторії журналістики суспільного інтересу на нашому сайті journallab.online. Будемо вам вдячні.
So, Olivier, I still want to, start to speak from, let's say, height of your background, because you are not a usual political scientist or just a professor at the University of European University Institute or, author of a lot of books on global Islam, on this crisis of culture. You really started as a student activist in the 60s, a pretty kind of in a person who really was on the ground in the 60s in Paris, in Afghanistan, in a lot of countries. So how you really, usually you describing yourself beyond your formal titles?
By training, I am a philosopher. No, I have a diploma in philosophy. When I was a student, I joined a radical extremist group of Maoists for, 2 years. No more. It was at the time, of the May 68, so we were speaking about revolution, all the things. Of course, it didn't work. I spent some time, with the workers in strike. They were striking in a plant and so. But it didn't work, fortunately. And so I became a backpacker. I went to Afghanistan on hitchhiking. It took me 4 weeks from Paris to Kabul. And I fell in love with Afghanistan. So I traveled on foot inside Afghanistan. So when I came back, I decided to continue my studies in philosophy, but also to learn Persian. So I went to the School of Oriental Languages, and I passed a diploma in 3 years in Persian literature and language and civilization. So I learned some Islamology at the university at the time. And for 8 years, I was a school teacher in the suburbs of Paris. I started a technical school. I was teaching philosophy. But every year I used to go to Afghanistan as a tourist, by road, traveling through Turkey, Iran, Pakistan. So for about 10 years. I also went to Yemen, so I was traveling a lot. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, I decided to continue to go inside Afghanistan, but of course, not on the official side, but on the side of the resistance, anti-Soviet resistance. So I took a leave, and for the next 6-7 years, I used to go every year, once again, sometimes twice a year, inside Afghanistan with the mujahideen. And I wanted to write a book on the impact of the war in a traditional society. I wrote the book in 1984. Because of the book, I was recruited by the French National Center for Scientific Research now. And since that time, I have been an academic.
How you see what's going on now? Because I separately want to speak on how we can discuss how the world, for instance, the word woke, the term woke, yes, is used today by the, let's say, current leadership in the US. And you wrote extensively, and you can maybe also explain more about how this is all used by the neoliberal culture. Not the neoliberal culture, how neoliberalism more or less also reduce society to the individual, but also that there is this kind of unusual combination of conservatives with neoliberalists. But at the same time, today we see this, let's say, deconstruction, more or less, pretty violent and pretty unusual, what I should say. Like all this taking away the projects like diversity, equality, and inclusiveness. If we speak about a couple of years ago, you were writing more or less how neoliberalism were just putting all the responsibilities to an individual, and how it's kind of how it was used. But how would you describe the current moment?
Neoliberalism is destroying the social links. For neoliberalism, there is only individuals. And these individuals are free to act, and they're responsible of what happens to them. You may be a successful entrepreneur or just, delivering pizza on your bike. It's up to you. The driver of Uber is seen as an individual entrepreneur. That's the first point with neoliberalism. It ignores the social link, and it lets everybody to go by itself in a society. The paradox is that the promoters of neoliberalism in society, like Ronald Reagan or Mrs. Thatcher, were conservative in terms of social links. They believed in family, traditional values, but they were promoting a vision of economy which precisely was destroying the communities. And Mrs. Thatcher said it explicitly. She said, society doesn't exist. I know only individuals. Now, the problem for the individuals is how to define yourself. If you cannot define yourself by belonging to a community, if the starting point is not a community, how do you define yourself? And what we have is a shift of the quest for identity from a group to an individual. The individual is defined by sexual markers, straight or homosexual or queer or what you want, LGBT+. You choose some sexual markers to define your gender. Then same thing for the race, which is a paradox. Race is no more seen as biological. It's seen as a cultural and social markers. Either you are defined by the others, or you decide to choose, if I can say that, or to stress your race. What we have now is the idea that the communities are not pre-existing. The communities are the results of individual choices. You join this or that community. And internet is fantastic for that, because on internet you choose. You decide to socialize with people who are fans of mangas, for instance, or who define themselves according to certain sexual characteristics of what you want. Diversity is not the recognition of pre-existing communities. It's the construction of a chosen communities. And hence, we can see, for example, multiculturalism in Europe or in the USA. It's not the importation of traditional cultures from Asia or what you want. It's a redefinition of the community based on some limited markers. The veil for the women, for instance, Muslim women, they wear a veil. And so, by wearing a veil, you decide to express your identity as a Muslim for women. Things like that. Even in religion now, you see it works also for the right, of the extreme right. The traditional Catholics now in Europe, they define themselves by using Latin, the Latin language, for the Mass. So what we have is a disconstruction of the society in specific communities which are self-defined by some markers, the use of some markers. And so we miss the very concept of society. That's the big problem with it. And it's, today, it has political consequences. You don't really feel that you are a member of a nation. You want your personal identity to be recognized by the state. But you don't care too much about the state. That's the big problem.
Generally, if you're observing what's now going on in the United States, I think your book in very thorough way and your thinking kind of explain this, symbolism of which is derealization kind of of the things when symbolic things matter so much. But at the same time, we also understand that what's happening now, and there is a level of the critique or, let's say, trying to explain, what is probably under the term woke. How would you explain that? But also, I think this term is actually became a very pejorative term for a lot of other things which connected to the society. And it's used in a very different way. If we speak today about current, let's say, about Elon Musk, for instance, and this narrative of the MAGA voters, how you differentiate them and how you would describe, what is happening with this canceling, like the culture which is happening today, the move which is happening today in the United States.
The woke system is based on two things. One is identity. According to the identity you choose or the identity which is given to you, you define yourself by a certain number of markers. The race, for instance, the gender, to be valid or to have an handicap, etc., etc. So we have a classification of categories. But then the second element is suffering. The classification is a moral classification on some sort of a domination scale. You are always either suffering because somebody is putting pressure, doesn't recognize your identity, or you are dominating somebody without acknowledging it. For instance, you are a black male. As a black male, you are suffering the domination by white people. But as a black male, you are also dominating black female. And so you are imposing your domination to a black female. And among black female, you may have female who have a handicap or who are healthy. And in this case, the healthy people are dominating the handicapped people. So the problem of the woke is to look for a moral reparation. First, for acknowledgement of domination, you should repent, and then you should erase, cancel the signs which makes you being dominated or suffering. But the sign, for instance, if you are a black person in the USA, you are suffering because you see symbols of slavery, like the statue of a general of the Confederation. So you ask for the removal of the statue, the removal of the sign. You don't make a revolution. You don't ask to take the power. That's an interesting thing with the woke system. The woke system is not revolutionary. The woke people do not want to take the state and to reorganize the society from the state. What they want is the state to apologize and to promote integration and promotion, etc., etc., diversity. So in this sense, wokeism is not an ideology. Wokeism is not a political movement. It's a moral movement with political consequences. But by definition, the woke are not looking for domination. They are not looking for power. It's why they lost. They lost. What is interesting is that, in fact, the woke didn't campaign against Trump. The woke, they always campaign inside their own bubble. For instance, at Columbia University, you occupy the campus and you ask the state to repent, but you don't go outside your campus. You don't go to the destitute neighborhoods to help the poor people, to help the poor black women, for instance, and so. So the Palestinian people are suffering now. So what do? You occupy the campus of Columbia University to suffer yourself in solidarity with the Palestinian people. But you don't do anything. You don't build a political coalition. You don't try to help, to send some sort of help to Palestine. You stage the suffering of the people. You play as if you were on a theater scene. So it's why the woke movement didn't work and was so easily, I wouldn't say destroyed, but for Trump, it's very easy to attack the woke movement because he attacks symbols. The black hole of the woke movement is simply politics. The woke didn't want to put their hands in the dirty world of politics. They play on a self-righteousness. We are the best people because we suffer for the others. Because when we are white, we repent to be white. But we do nothing. It's more than deculturation here. It's desocialization. And it goes along, You fight for markers, for symbols. You don't care about any kind of real culture. You cancel, in terms of culture, you cancel the elements of any culture which do not fit with your vision of what is right and what is wrong. But you don't really try to change the society. So we have deculturation, desocialization, and the consequence, depolitization. It largely explains the defeat of the Democrats because their own basis simply didn't move.
What would be then an alternative? Because in this regard, and at the same time, how do you see such things as what's happening, for instance, with this Palestinian student in the Columbus? So you can speak about the symbolic gesture that they didn't reach out the real issues. But at the same time, we're now speaking about a real person having the risks of being, even arrested, and also what happened with this silent campaign when the Columbia says, don't criticize any longer, don't do the symbolic gestures, hide your idea, we cannot protect you. So what is the risk as well? Because, we can explain the defeat, but also what are the risks of the current situation?
Very simply is that the new power, Trump, can crush the woke movement without sending police and troops in the streets. Because the movement has no political dimension. It's not an organized movement. So they protest. And now what they do? They go to courts. They want the state to repent, to change its policy. They ask the judge to condemn Trump. But they are spineless. They do not have a real social basis. So it's they protest, they demonstrate, but you can see that there are not so many people in the demonstrations. They stay in the symbolic. Instead of going, for instance, canvassing from door to door, speaking to the people, trying to mobilize people at the local level, to go to the villages, to make real propaganda, etc., etc. No, they just protest in front of a camera. They say, we don't accept what Trump is doing. Okay, good. They go to court. When I say that now everything is about norms, it's clear that the only power which is independent for the moment is the judicial power. But it's very fragile. If Trump just say, no, I don't care about the judges, what will the judges do? That's the big problem of the liberal societies. It's based on law, but if the president say, I don't care about law, the president already took the military power, he took in his hands the police, the FBI, he took everything in his hands, and he just doesn't care about law. Now, we'll see what will go with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is not very opposed to Trump, but they are professional lawyers. So maybe they will say, as the Supreme Court, we cannot accept this and that. So what? And it's what we have now to wait for the moment when the Supreme Court will say no to Trump. It is a trial moment of a liberal democracy. When the elected power just doesn't care about the law, who can bring back the law above the power? We don't know.
What can be done? You're really coming from your also, experience, let's say practical, because you also, like we're saying, you tried a lot of like street actions, your life, if we're speaking about the past. What are actually the real actions then? Because we're now speaking about like symbolic things, norms, codes. But what are then these real actions which are changing the things?
For the moment, I don't see real actions. I think we have to wait for the process to go a bit further. Of course, one thing which is very important is economy. The electorate of Trump is not an ideological electorate, most of them. Of course, they are mainly white, they are mainly conservative. But as we saw in the elections, you have many former migrants voted for Trump. So it's not the usual fascism at all. So these people, they expect a better life. What the paradox is that it's the economy which might bring the real back into politics. It's economy which might show that it's not just a matter of symbols, of codes, but it's a matter of real life, everyday life. So we have to wait for an economic crisis. And on the other hand, when you have this kind of craziness at the top of the state, sooner or later, there is a crisis at the top of the state because the president cannot rule just alone. He has different supporters. You have Elon Musk on one hand, you have Steve Bannon on the other hand, you have the vice president, and all these people, they do not necessarily agree between themselves. The paradox is that it's like the court of an Ottoman sultan or of a despot king, tsar, the old Europe. The people is white, but inside the court, inside the power, there will necessarily be sooner or later frictions, quarrels, and settlement of grounds, which might reopen the road towards more political actions. But we have to wait. Just now, we are helpless. Except that Europe has no choice. Or more exactly, Europe is confronted with a choice. Either we go to the Trump direction with Orban, with Meloni. There are many populists who, in fact, are happy about what is going on. What they don't understand is that Trump will despise them. Trump despise them. Trump has no allies. If you are nice with Trump, as Mrs. Meloni is doing, you will not be rewarded at all. He's treating everybody the same, friends or enemies. They are all seen as enemies by Trump. And the other way is to say, okay, now Europe is alone. We are no more supported by liberal America. And we have to stick to our principles. But we have now to defend our principles. So we have to rearm. But to rearm, we need huge consensus among the population, among the public opinion. Because for the first time since a long time, we have to tell people, are you ready to die for your way of life, your principles? And we don't know the answer, We don't know the answer. For the young generation, the idea of joining the army, etc., is exotic. It's something which doesn't belong to their way of life, to their everyday life. It looks very strange, the idea of going to joining the army, etc. So it depends on the people. We are confronted with a choice. Are we ready to fight, to defend our way of life, or to surrender?
On this idea that the war or the idea to take the arms is exotic. I'm speaking to you from Kiev, where this idea used to be exotic, honestly, even 3 years ago. It's not even 10 years ago before the full-scale invasion. But what we also understanding, and I'm desperately searching for one of the quotes, where you're speaking about the real social bonds in the society, that the realities of the war, for instance, for Ukraine, they really created the, like this grounding of your life, the grounding of the values, because you clearly understand what is the freedom? It's not a concept. What is the solidarity? It's not a concept. What actually is a social bond? Your economy is not a finance. It's not like this. It's absolutely practical, and it's really so much not virtual, but real, that we all understand that, yes, there is the place for the armed struggle in this world, and technically it's the real one. Honestly, it's not the only one, but it's... How do you see that today? And how it can be... I'm not having a call for the, Europeans to arm themselves, but what do you think, how we can move and make this also things more real to some of the Europeans, to the people, that it's not so theoretical and not so exotic in the current moment, especially when you do have, rather democratic society in Ukraine, which kind of went through this way within the last couple of years, which was pretty unusual for us as well, as probably for any society which enjoyed the peace for quite a long time.
That's the big question. And there is no easy solutions, easy way to do that, to bring back a sense of solidarity between people who may disagree between themselves, because by definition, politics is disagreement. But now the tendency, the trend, is to look only to people who think like you, who are like you on the internet, and to ignore, or more than that, to hate the other people. When in the old politics, you had debates in your neighborhood, in your village, at the time of elections, people come to the local square or to the city hall, and they used to disagree, to debate, but at least they knew each other. At least they were able to speak, even if they were shouting, they were able to speak to the other, to their neighbor. Now you don't have neighbors. You stay in your home and you speak to people like you through internet. You go outside, of course, to fetch bread and wine and beer and what you want, but you bring your beer back to your home and you drink by speaking to people who are like you through internet. That's the problem, the crisis of the social bind. And so the problem is to ground this feeling of belonging into something concrete, into a real society. And it's not the way our politicians are doing. What they do is they are doing speeches. We should, but they are contributing to destroy the traditional links, social links. For instance, we had in France the movement of the called les Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest. It was a call from below, for more solidarity, for more socialization, and it was met by the police. Instead of discussing with these people who were not fascist at all, who just wanted to be recognized, to get some dignity. We have a failure of the traditional political parties. The political parties are no more grounded into the society. All parties are becoming populist parties in terms of relationship with the leadership. You have a leader. He might be liberal, leftist, rightist, what you want. And the leader is speaking directly to the people. But the apparatus of the party are disappearing everywhere. You have nobody to speak with. You should listen to the leader, but you have nobody to discuss politics. So that's a big problem. Now it's 5 years after the COVID. So we have after the lockdown. And we have a lot of discussion now, if you look in the newspaper in Europe, on the impact of the lockdown. And it's interesting because the lockdown has precisely exacerbated the trends which I am describing in my books. Keeping yourself in your home, making internet the easiest way of socialization, etc., etc. An everyday life full of norms, codification. You should wear the mask, you should go there, not go there, etc., etc. The paradox is that the COVID pandemic was the staging, if I can say that, the mise en scène of the crisis of culture today. The good thing is that everybody is realizing that yes, because of the lockdown, we missed something. We have a lost generation. And the idea that we should reconnect as much as possible with our environment, our society, is on the table. People are speaking about that, which is positive. By definition, human beings are social beings. You know? They need to connect. My hope is that we are such in an extreme direction that people might realize we should stop. Trump, it's interesting. He has a paralyzing effect. Everybody says, no, it's not possible. It's not possible, but it is possible. And it will be worse and worse. So let's take the Canadians. You know, they were very divided in Canada between the right and the left, the liberal and the conservative, etc. But suddenly they realize that it's a matter of existing. To resist Trump, they have no choice. Either they will disappear as Canadians, or they have to do something now. And the reflex is working in Canada. So I'm expecting some sort of the same thing in Europe. Okay, we went too far in the direction of abstraction, internet, etc. We have to go back to the basics. Who are we? What do we want? To reconnect with our own society.
Why, more rhetoric question is whether you really need to have a, horrible crisis or even a tragedy to return to kind of basis. Because, in case of Ukraine, when you really speak about the COVID, we live through more or less the same thing at the whole world. It's a liberal, modern society of the 21st century. But if you have an alert and the strike, the super rich and the poor are in the same basement, in the same train, and they know each other. The same is speaking about the army, because Ukraine was pretty equal society. If you speak about 90s, beyond like uber rich, I'm speaking about a couple of those oligarchs, but people were equally from poor background. We didn't have this legacy rich people, like through all of them are gone within the last century. And this started to appear within the last generation. But then in the army, you have like a super rich and the farmer and a very poor soldier and somebody from the village, which also create this very odd bond of the people who for the last decades of very modern Western type of society have never chanced to, the barista from Kiev hipsterish cafe would rarely talk to the, a guy who was a prison guard in the provincial village. It could be like that. And this bond is there, which also made people kind of be more connected. But what I want to understand, the role of the social and of the dignity, because you mentioned the word dignity very much. We called our Euromaidan Revolution 2014, the revolution of dignity. But it also was a lot about values, freedom, respect by the police, respect by the government. Also, this discrimination which was there, quite a, fight against, for some freedoms. But what I understood was critical about return of the dignity to the Ukrainian societies after 2022. It's like doctors lost their dignity before COVID, the nurses, but then they reclaimed them. In case of Ukraine, a lot of people of the working professions, railway workers, maybe janitors, maybe communal workers in the cities, they were on the margin. The success was very much the idea of, a guy, a Kiev IT person, something like that. And all of a sudden, you started understood that you have the boards across the country with the communal workers of the city of Kramatorsk on the forefront. The guy who probably has a very tiny salary, but is repairing the electricity grid in the town in the eastern Ukraine. So it's really about the return of dignity. I felt like that's a lot of people felt again proud, and that's why some of them are mobilized. Sometimes there is a risk to say it's about the dignity, but it's also about the social status and actual income. How much it's about the dignity. Because also when you really speak about the US, I covered so many elections for the last 5 American elections. What was fascinating for me in 2016 and 2020 and 2024, that Of course, there are a lot of poor white, hillbilly. I reported that 2016. There are, but I remember more poor people in 2008 during the economic crisis. But in a lot of these cases, people were not that utterly poor, and they were speaking they are. However, they were not that much, to be honest. So, they were speaking about the idea that we lost the jobs, but there was a man whom we asked in the queue to the Trump's rally, why are you voting for him? It's about the lost job. Have you lost the job? He said, no. And do you know anybody who lost the job? And he said, no. So, it's also like symbolic and fictional. So for you, coming from this background, how is it part of this identification about the dignity and the values? And how much is it actual payment, as some of the left try to speak today? That, no, it's all, So how you balance those things?
It's a real problem because in objective terms, the situation is not so bad. But people have a sense of demotion, of losing their status. It's reinforced, of course, also reinforced by immigration, which has a negative impact on the vision of the social cohesion. But there is a malaise. There is a feeling of not being adapted to our society, to be a loser. And it's not always objective, but it's a feeling. It's a feeling. And the feeling is also to have been betrayed by the political elites. A lack of confidence. I think there is a crisis of the big narratives. The problem of democracy today, it is that it has no narrative, in the sense that the idea is not that you will be more happy. There is no, we had for 2 centuries the idea that to be a citizen is to achieve the best of humanity, of humanism, that a belief in the value of humanity. And now it has disappeared. It has disappeared because of individualism, of what we want. But there is no more any secular narrative of what is a nation, what is the future, what is history, etc. It's also connected with the crisis of high culture. Surely, the schools used to be the vector, the transmitter of narratives. Of course, some of these narratives were bad, communism and things like that. But at least the schools were speaking of the society, of the future. Now, nothing. The decline of humanities has consequences of the decline of narratives.
So, but you're an academic who started as, I won't say practitioner, revolutionary. But that's today, because there are so many, it's like even the theme of this crisis of the culture, the book is so broad, but we also speak in a very specific moment. I maybe want to explain, if you allow me to say, this major I don't know whether it is major thing in the book, but explaining the idea that in modern world, you're really speaking about the crisis of culture, because more or less how it was reduced to the norms and codes instead of the values. But your idea is about something that actually this crisis of culture is probably the core of quite a lot of troubles we are in.
Yeah, I started to study this issue by studying religion. My first academic work was on Islam in Afghanistan. On the field, on the spot, I witnessed religious change, which me and my colleagues will find everywhere, not only in Islam, but also in Christianity, which is what I call the deculturation of religion. Concretely speaking, in Islam, it was a rise of Salafism, a fundamentalist, normative vision of Islam. My question was, why is it successful? What is going on? And then I realized that, in fact, this new form of religious fundamentalism is against culture. They are explicitly considering that culture is either too secular or is even, a danger for religion because it replaced religion by culture. There was a conflict between religion and culture. And this is something which is quite new. Traditionally, religion is very connected with culture. Christianity was connected with the Roman Empire. Christianity did embody itself inside the Roman and Greek culture of the antiquity. Europe was largely built on Christianity, the Middle Ages, the Crusades, etc. Of course, we had a wave of secularism in Europe from the, let's say, the 17th, 18th century. But the dominant culture was heavily influenced by Christianity, either as a Catholics, or the Protestants. So, but when I came back from Afghanistan with, this vision of Salafism as religion against culture, I found in Europe evangelicalism, Protestant evangelicalism, the rise of evangelicalism. And myself, I'm a Protestant, a Calvinist by family. My grandfather was a Calvinist pastor, priest. So I was part of a culturally embedded Calvinism. And suddenly I saw the rise among the Protestants of a new generation, usually, from lower social classes, from immigration, who didn't care about culture, who didn't read novels, who didn't go to museum, but they were only fascinated by salvation. So this stress on salvation and this despise of culture. But then I realized that the common point between this evangelicalism and Salafism is normativity, because nothing is obvious, nothing is embedded into culture which is considered as too secular. They have to make explicit the rules of the life. What is sin, what is good, what is bad, what are the conditions of salvation, etc., etc. And they were fighting arts and culture. They didn't go to movies, they didn't read books, etc., etc. That's my first point, How we have a disconnect between religion and culture. And I wrote a book for ignorance about that. But then realizing that the crisis of religion, which is the shift towards fundamentalism, is not something which is just depending of religion, is in fact connected with the crisis of culture. And hence my last book, the crisis of culture. The fundamentalist religions are rising in a global world where culture is disappearing. Because of globalization, because of secularization, because of internet, because of many reasons, So I don't try to look at the causes of this shift, this deculturation. But for me, it was obvious that we have the problem of deculturation. The first thing is communication. We communicate through language. Languages are always connected with a culture. Hence the problems of translating from one language to the other. The language produces high culture. Not always, but usually you have French literature, Russian literature, English literature, you have Dostoevsky, you have Shakespeare, etc. And this high culture is embedded into a real society, a civilization. And what we see now is that communication excludes culture. When we speak English now, what I call rubbish, we don't need to know English literature, but it's better not to know English literature. If when speaking English with a Japanese, for instance, for your business or for traveling, what you want, if you quote Shakespeare or poetry of 18th century, you miss the communication. It doesn't work. So if you want to communicate at the global level, you have to use a simplified language of communication, a simplified English, without any cultural reference to English or British literature. And that's exactly what is going on now. Let's take another example. Emotions. Emotions are very cultural. You have different ways to cry or to smile. If you are Japanese, if you are an American, if you are an Italian, etc., etc. Normally, you have to understand the meaning of body language in the different cultures you are meddling with. You should understand that when a Japanese smile, it's not necessary that he is friendly. But it's a problem for global communication. So what do we have now? It's the rejection of cultural body languages and the replacement by emoji or emoticon. We have a list of ready-made emotions that we can share with others at one condition, to be explicit. So you put your emoji on your message, and the other, your respondent, your interlocutor, understand exactly what you mean, because we use an explicit sign of specific emotions, which is totally disconnected from our real culture and from our private life. So that's the first point. Communication is now set up outside any culture. And then the last point, when you have a code like that, you have to know the code. You have to learn the code now. It's like, the code to drive a car in the streets. A red light is a red light, and you have to stop. A green light is a green light, and you have to go. You cannot interpret. You cannot say that you don't love the green or things like that. You have to obey. You have to obey the explicit codification of life. And it's exactly what is going on with emotion, attitudes, feelings, any kind of interaction with the everyday life.
I find it fascinating, this idea you're saying that the only kind of positive, movement which made the youth engaged within the last decades is the climate change, but it's also driven not by the utopia of creating, like the world where we have a clean air and beautiful oceans and, like these type of things, but more or less fearing the people with the apocalypse of, a broken climate. So, like you're frightening the people all the time. So you fight to avoid the catastrophe. So why you think it's really so hard to not to have any kind of at least utopian idea? Because, and I also, I'll return now to Ukraine. Of course, Ukrainians fighting not to be occupied, not to live in the concentration camp, not to be, totally eliminated. Of course, it's also the fight against the horror and catastrophe. But at the same time, when you really talk to the people, they literally fighting for the better life, for the life when you can be with your friend, with your family, when there is no missiles on top of you, that you can actually spend a day without being worried so somebody would die in your family or something. You're still thinking about a bit different kind of future of a proper country and that people would return to a better state. So, so for us, it's also this kind of double-edged sword. It's your choice, whether you are being afraid of something and you're doing something or you're building something. But why it's so hard? Why, this utopia? Because it's like the utopia of communism was so damaging, or people became afraid of utopia, or like we are so cynical. There is this tradition of this cynicism. How we can fight this cynicism as well, maybe.
Of course, there is this disillusion about utopia. But still, I think that people need utopia. We need to have the idea that the future we might have a brighter future than now. And the problem, as you said, with the youth, for the first time, we have a youth which consider that the future is a threat, a danger, that the future will be worst, and that we, in a sense, they are trying not to establish a better society, but to stop history, to stop the time, and to return to a previous state of relationship between human beings and nature. It's the contrary of utopia. And it explains why we have a lot of nihilistic trends among the youth today. A lot of suicidal attitudes. Terrorism is a suicidal attitude. The young boys who go to their own school and kill their former friends at school, like Colombia and the USA, etc. And many of the political ideologies on the field now are also apocalyptic. We have a return of the concept of apocalyptic time in the religions. The evangelical, they speak about the end of the world, the end of time. Same with the Salafi in Islam. So we see that at different levels, political level, religious level, or psychological level, people are more obsessed by nihilism and fear than by hope in the future.
I'm like pushing very hard into like finding a bit of the solution still, because I remember also a meeting when I was speaking at the university of the smaller town of Mendoza in Argentina I'm working on the documentation of the war crime. And it was very interesting because it was not Buenos Aires, but, the students of the international law. And it was kind of a promulgate type of the place. But there was a students who this kind of neoliberal, who liked Elon Musk, who were totally like into Milei, but also the girls who were freaking out because, they were feminist and something. And they were sitting together, but the girl really asked I'm just paralyzed. I'm just paralyzed. I don't know what to do. What should I do? She literally asked. And I said, do something. Believe in something. Believe just in anything. Find one thing you believe and do that. And it was my way to say it shouldn't be always something big, but unless something small. Because what I believe that in Russia and in these authoritarian societies also, it's not really about the particular ideology. It's really this idea that it's nothing depends on me. I can't do anything. But where do you see globally, the places where, okay, let's say even not globally, because I also think in the countries we live through change where things are happening, people are more motivated, being in Taiwanese or Koreans or, Indonesians, they're trying to fix something in their country. They're fighting against something. But in Europe, there were a lot of talks okay, let's talk about climate change. Maybe that's the way to engage. And that's how the politicians also were trying to guess where the things people are ready to get engaged, especially youth. What are you thinking are the things where people can get engaged if there is no any longer this usual social bond, by speaking about this, as you called it, Uberization of the economy, where really, it's not really the workers. Wherever you think that people would work online, people would be in IT. People might not see each other. There is little chance to return the labor unions because there is a progress. We all believe in this kind of AI development. So where you see this maybe islands of where the real actions can really happen.
It's my message to the youth. Speak to people who are not like you. Don't try to find always people who are like yourselves. On the contrary, to rebuild the social links, we have to accept the diversity of the society and not to impose some sort of a controlled diversity as it is done now. So social activism, do something at the level of your neighborhood, your village, of your workplace, but do something, speak with people, engage in social life and not on internet social life, because you will find always the same people. It's a mirror. You will find yourself on the internet. Try to find diversity. And you mentioned the army. It's a very good example. In the army, you don't choose the people you are with, and you are stuck in a trench with people you would never have spoken to before. That's the kind of experience. That's what I did experience when I was traveling at war in Afghanistan, things like that. I am not saying that we need a war, not at all, of course. But we need to engage directly with the others, to do something to rebuild a social link at the grassroots level before engaging to politics.
I was interested also in the concept, what you call that instead of the repatriation for the past troubles, this idea of the suffering, you better think about the right future, a different future for ourselves. And I think you were speaking about this discourse about, slavery and discourse about repatriation for the slavery in the US, and this idea of, people, the suffering which has been caused. I really like this idea, and I put it right away into kind of the Ukrainian discourse, because we also, want to, let's say, fight for us being that we would have a different future. But at the same time, where is a place for accountability? I said, I'm working on the issue of the documenting war crimes. We're speaking about the thousands of the people who lived through horrible experience, which couldn't be fixed, but, they probably want to have some justice. In this regard, when we shortly mentioned that, how easy it is to make the decision of the court symbolic. And, it's also, to say that it doesn't have a real effect. And we're now looking as well how all this, also the United States government today is fighting the, International Criminal Court, all kind of things. And the whole idea of the accountability. We're speaking about now, negotiations or talks between Trump and Putin, where the idea of accountability is not present. But lack of accountability brings probably impunity, imposes impunity. So where is this balance that you still need to accountability, but you still don't want to be haunted by the idea of, your suffering and victimhood? And how to do it if you really also speak about the, the history of Europe for the last, decades, because there is also a choice to be made, or at least some kind of a balance imposed.
We need accountability, of course, by definition. The problem is that the way we look for accountability is very judicial, very based on law, and not on history or even not on moral vision. So we are trying to make individuals accountable, to punish this and this guy as responsible. But it's not just a matter of crimes. It's a matter, I would say, of history also. It's a system. It's not just, Milosevic or the leaders of the Khmer Rouge, for instance. It's not enough to put people to trial, to put individuals to trial. So in this case, the accountability by courts, it's also a way to individualize history, individualize society. Or this guy is responsible for genocide, a massacre, and so. But it's more complex than that. Of course, you have history. How was it possible? It's not just because there is a guy. And then when you don't look at the system, once you have punished, the big guys, then it's finished. Now, you say, it's okay, problem is solved. No, the problem is not solved because you have hundreds of people. And if you go too far, too in depth for accountability, then you will put tens of thousands to courts, which at the end doesn't work, So I would say we have to take a more distance now and to look at a system more as a individual responsibility. We are still stuck in this individualism. The way we see accountability is also a translation of our conception of the society as a collection of individuals and not as a real society.
Olivier, do you feel kind of anxiety these days? I'm speaking about everything happening because when I talk to a lot of thinkers, publicists, or, everybody, with what's going on in the US, people, are kind of freaking out a lot. And I feel these concerns. But how are you?
When I started my career, I knew that I will not be a school teacher for all my life. No. So I said, what kind of job can I do where I will always find a job? And my answer was crisis. So I worked the war in Afghanistan. I was in Tajikistan during the civil war. I studied terrorism, etc. I wouldn't say I'm fascinated by crises because crises are, of course, dangerous for the society, not just for individuals. But at least when you have a crisis, people are obliged to take responsibility, to make choices. So in this sense, Trump is a good crisis because it's not the Soviet army or the Russian army invading Europe. No. It's still largely symbolic or touching, it's not killing, at least now. But he obliges us to take responsibility, to make choices. What do we want? And that's good.
I would really want to ask you to have a final thing because I asked more about your book, but we have a Ukrainian audience just to understand what are your thoughts at this stage about the Russian war against Ukraine? How you do see these crises? How do you see this in this moment of history? I'm not speaking about the Trump, but I'm speaking about the last moment of this invasion when you thought that unthinkable became thinkable, when the arms are already back, when the youth is fighting here in Europe for what we call the real values. So that is my take, obviously, I'm a bit imposing it. But I still want to ask you, because you saw the real war in different society, but you saw it. You understand the difference of the life at wars. And so how do you see this war?
There are two ways. One is to look at the vision. I was in Soviet Union when Soviet Union collapsed. And it was extraordinary. The people were totally lost. Nobody understood what was happening because nothing was happening. No war, no revolution, no demonstration. Just suddenly, there was in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, people are citizens of a new country. You have a new flag and everything is new. Nothing is working and you don't understand. So the trauma of the collapse of Soviet Union among the Russian people has been terrible. And Europe didn't help because the idea was, we have to deal with the regime because they have no choice. They have to make a peace with the West. We have a lot to offer them. So there was this patronizing attitude from Europe towards Russia. We missed an opportunity. Clearly, we miss an opportunity. And Putin is playing on that, on this psychological trauma. It's a society with no brains, in a sense, lacking brains now. I made myself a mistake when, just after the invasion of Ukraine, I said, it will not work because the Russian society is too sophisticated now. They have middle class, upper classes, people are educated, they have internet, so they will not follow. But except, 1 million people who left, precisely the sophisticated people, they left Russia. The other, they didn't really oppose. The opposition is very weak, and not just because of repression. It's weak, no. So we miss this psychological dimension. And on the other side, I think that Ukraine is defending Europe. That we have no choice, that we should support Ukraine, because Russia's perspective is terrible. Putin is living in a narrative of the tsars, Peter the Great, going back to the Baltic, going back to the Mediterranean Sea, etc. Nothing will stop him if he's not stopped now at the border. So there is a dimension of craziness with Putin. But the problem is that this craziness now is shared by many leaders in the world. That's extraordinary. We have a crazy guy in Washington, a crazy guy in Moscow, a crazy guy in Buenos Aires. We had a crazy guy in Brasilia. So he's still crazy, but he's no more the head of the state. This kind of psychiatrical crisis among the world leaders is fascinating and very dangerous. We always had crazy autocrats. But now we have elected crazy autocrats, which is a sign that the societies are in a big moral crisis.
Still, you said that the Russians were lost, after the fall of the Soviet Union. But look, Ukrainians were also the part of it. They were also lost financially. I mentioned this kind of lack of the dignity, the financial crisis, the loss of the usual way of life. So what was the savior for us in that regard? Is it that we were lucky not to have an empire and not to think that, because in our case, nothing was great ever, to be honest, like to have this myth, or the fact that we just literally managed to have the elections and the change of power, what Belarus people didn't. Because I also can't just say that post-Soviet people were lost. But yes, we were lost all, but not all of us ended up where we are now.
Because you had a narrative and an objective, the Ukrainian nation state, patriotism. You had a perspective which is anchored in history. So you had this historical narrative. We can discuss about languages, religion. It's the issue to the extent that it has been turned into a positive narrative. And it's why Ukraine was able to resist to the Russian. If not, it's this, I would not say nationalistic, I would say patriotic, more than nationalistic. You had a new perspective the day the Soviet Union collapsed. While the people in Moscow, they had a sense of demotion, of losing everything, including in the everyday life. In the communist system, you had no problem with everyday life. You have, of course, to find food and things like that. But everything was organized. You knew the rules. You had the official rules and the informal rules. And you knew how to manage that. You had your friends and you could survive. Don't do politics. But suddenly everything collapsed. Why in Ukraine? Okay, everything collapsed. Then suddenly you had a new narrative. Let's build Ukraine as a nation state.
Yeah, so actually we managed to confirm that also by some of the sociological polling we worked on in still 2018, like way before, when you really thought that Ukraine, if you really divide it, it's not about Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, but definitely there were people who are a bit more nostalgic, who felt like we lost more during the fall of the Soviet Union and the people who gained. But in the end, we figure out through the focus groups that even people who lost, they were proud what they gained in the 90s, that they overcome. They were proud by their resilience. They were proud by something. So in this regard, if you also feed this narrative of the loss, it kind of, like it happened in the Russia, it can work one way. But if the same narrative is saying like you lost, but you overcome, you can get out of that. And that was also my part of the findings. But I think that it's very interesting. I think that we overall managed to find some of the solutions saying that technically having kind of some positive narrative overall rather than just like having it as in front of you is probably the only way out to get out of this. Otherwise, you just can't fight your ghost all the time. You're hunted by them. You'll be hunted and most probably you'll be still defeated because it's very hard unless you have somewhere to go further. Thank you so much.